It's interesting that the question is framed, what is my work? And my friendly amendment would be our work is at the Public Science Project at the Graduate Center. We are engaged as researchers with community activists, with organizers, with women in prison, with queer youth, with women whose lives and labor has been disrupted by COVID-19. We collectively engage in research to document oppression, document privilege, document resistance, and help folks tell a counter story to the one that's being told about them, and generate material that can be used in campaigns for a sweeter tomorrow. So as researchers, we work with community-based organizations, with activists, and with communities under siege to collaboratively generate research that works alongside struggles for justice. I can tell 3 genealogy stories. I come to the work as the daughter of Jewish immigrants from Poland. My mom, refugees, Jews. My mom was the youngest of 18. And I grew up during an era that Karen Brodkin Sachs would call when the Jews became white. So I could bear witness to the ways in which kind of trading identities to whiteness in the US enabled us a set of advantages about which I've always had certainly pleasure and radical discomfort. So there's the genealogy of privilege and activism. Although my father sold junk on the Lower East Side, we were not wealthy at all, but whiteness escorted me into academic spaces in particular that afforded me a set of privileges. So that's one lineage. A second lineage is academically, I'm the granddaughter of Kurt Lewin. My mentor, Morton Deutsch, worked with the action researcher Kurt Lewin, who understood the relationship of person and environment and the importance of action research. And so my work has always been in justice studies. And the third story is not a story I tell a lot, but my first book was a book called Framing Dropouts, and it was an ethnography of a public high school in New York City, mostly kids of color. I spent a year at the school and then wrote a book on how race and class help shape public institutions in a way that produces massive failure for communities of color, with kind of no one being held accountable for that. And it was a book that got famous fast. And it was kind of told from the point of view of the young people who were pushed out. The opening segment begins with a field note to myself where I'm at graduation and 250 kids are graduating in a school of 3,000. And I note that I'm crying and taken by the beauty of the parents and the grandparents and the relatives and the friends from Puerto Rico and the Bronx and Harlem. And I want a moment of silence for the 500 bodies that are missing when 750 started 9th grade and 250 graduated. And that book got famous fast for good reasons, and I fear bad ones. And someone I respected said to me, Michelle, it's a great book, but your representation of the teachers is, now this is probably my word, not theirs, but it's two-dimensional. They're kind of stick figures in a complicit system, and you feature with complexity the students who are pushed out, but not the teachers. And is that fair to the teachers? And I'm not sorry I wrote the book, but that really struck me that my preference turned at that point to more participatory work with communities and professionals and practitioners to try to understand how we have come to the circumstances in which we find ourselves and how it might be otherwise, rather than to feature one group and by reference make thin and superficial the characterization of the folks who are trying to make a difference in impossible circumstances. So I think in the late 80s, early 90s, I turned toward participatory work. It's evolved dramatically, but I understood then that I wanted to do research with, not on. And at that time, I was also doing research with women in prison and with women with disabilities, neither of which I was, but we committed to studying the structures, the histories, the lives, and the solidarities that might tell a different story, both about gender and disability, but also about women in prison. So I come to this from family, from watching from the margins, a nation that welcomed my parents in. I come to this through academic justice studies, but I come from this also from both the joys of my research and critiques of my research. So I move toward a more participatory, or what you might call community engaged frame. And the last thing I think I'll say is that when I was growing up, my parents reproduced the dynamic that I think a lot of immigrant families carry, where Papa goes out and does America and becomes American, and the mom, my mother, held the sadness, the despair, the loss, the memory of what was left behind. So my mother was in bed a lot with headaches and migraines, and I was her youngest, so I was home with her a lot. And I always knew that the story of progress and the story of depression slept together, and that I could never just tell one story without the other. And so I knew from her, and then from women in prison, that women who don't have much of a voice and carry social wounds have incredible knowledge, and that if I could contribute humbly to help elevate and animate with those women the stories they would tell about themselves, that was a commitment that was deep in my biography. So my academic mentors were Morton Deutsch, who did justice studies, Maxine Green, who just did everything with red lipstick and radical imagination and aesthetics. And I think I took his justice studies and her commitment to wide awakeness and just moved it over a bit to what I would call epistemic justice, the question of whose knowledge counts. And I found allies in liberation psychology, in Latin American and South American scholars. Not so much in this country. I knew Paulo Freire. We were friends, whom I loved. I wouldn't say he was so participatory, but he understood people had a lot of knowledge inside very marginalized circumstances. So I think it's a stitching together. I'm never really comfortable in a single community. It makes me nervous to just be a psychologist, or just a white Jewish woman, or just a hetero, like all those categories I want to destabilize. So stitching, I think, comes naturally to me, or what some people would call radical marginality, like looking from the sides. So I've always been interested in remaining a kind of dedicated, theoretically grounded critical scholar. And I think early on I got exposed to critical race theory when I was at Penn. I was at the Ed School, and it was a really rich interdisciplinary space. And so I was invited really to engage broadly. I wasn't constrained as a psychologist. I then came back to psych. Lonnie Guinier and I wrote a book on critical race theory and law school socialization. So I think I've been, like, my dad was a junk salesman. He like went around and picked up scraps. I think I did that. I think I picked up intellectual scraps and stitched them together with a practice that felt like it had integrity to my biography and my political and ethical commitments. But yeah, there weren't a lot of folks around doing the work. But there was like smells of it, like pollen, like participatory pollen was starting to circulate. I am many things simultaneous in the work. I am the white senior woman often. I am the person who goes to court and represents the voices and perspectives of youth of color when there's finance inequity in their schools. I'm often an expert witness in California, now in Baltimore, in Arizona, where I gather narratives from young people, and then I use my whiteness in court to get a hearing for the stories the kids of color could have just told them if anybody was listening. So I think a lot about what's the obligation, what's the work, what's the debt of white academics in a time where we should be humbled, stepping aside, stepping back. Just as you suggested, the days of let me hold the door open so scholars of color and folks who want to do PAR can enter, like, well done. There's a generation of us and many people of color who participated in that. But I think now my obligation is to keep an eye not only on centering those most impacted by injustice, but animating how privilege flows up. Like, who benefits in gentrified neighborhoods? Who benefits from high stakes testing? We're in an argument now nationally about whether to test kids this spring in public schools. And that's an enormous abuse of money in times where money doesn't exist. And yet just yesterday, President Biden indicated that he's so inclined to ask for testing in the spring. And many of us have been meeting, mostly as senior white people, saying, who's benefiting from this? Test companies are, and privatizers are, and even all the discourse of learning loss. On the one hand, kids have learned a lot, and on the other hand, yes, there's been loss, but instead of sticking a thermometer in them, why don't we just give them more resources? So I feel like my work these days is always to be with. Like, my friends of color know where they belong. They know with whom they belong. They know the questions they want to be asking. It's not totally fair, but it's partly fair. As a white woman, I'm not sure where I belong. I'm not sure with whom. I'm not sure who my community is. But I'm best working in solidarities with women in prison, with queer youth, if I can name the privileges that have come from the systems that have oppressed others, that have benefited me, and begin to kind of peel away the capillaries of privilege and inequity, not just the disparities that live in the bodies of most impacted communities. I feel like those of us who are white have an obligation to call out white supremacy, white privilege, colonial practices, but also to reveal the codes of power, to share power, to step back, um, to advocate bold things about that need to be dismantled in our universities that have worked as kind of gated communities around race and class and disability. So, so I think about positionality, but I think about commitments and like what are our commitments and obligations these days. And when I teach methods classes, I always have students, the first thing we do is write a letter to someone to whom our research is accountable. Um, it could be a child, it could be your former self, it could be someone in prison, it could be an apartment building that was gentrified, it could be a community you're from that's now gone, it could be a language your family used to practice that you no longer speak. And those questions of accountabilities feel really important, and I think it's a more circuitous route for those of us who are white. Um, but we have to be intentional about that because we know too many secrets about how power works to not expose those and help build a different tomorrow. So when I think about critical community engagement, for me, critical is like a placeholder. We do critical participatory action research, and it's a placeholder for signifying that we are aware from the beginning that there are huge power inequities and that it is our obligation, particularly coming from the university, or particularly as an academic, or particularly as a white woman who's well educated. It is our obligation to trouble those inequities and not simply act as though, well, we're partners. Like we know there are huge financial status, power inequities that need to be contended with. And whether that means we start from critical race theory or queer theory or decolonizing theory or Marxist or critical disability studies, we're starting with a recognition that we live in, are complicit with, and are also resisting enormous inequities, unmasked by COVID, exacerbated by COVID. So that's where we start. That's very different than doing a nice thing for the community. It's not for the community, it's with. So I want to trouble critical. I want to trouble community because the university is part of a community. Like we're not really separate. It's just that we don't pay taxes in the same way other community institutions do, but we are part of, we reproduce the inequities of the larger community. Sometimes we're helpful around those inequities, but it's not like there's the real world and the academic world. We're part of it. The racism in the larger world is in the academy. The racial capitalism is in the academy. The gender, disability, heteronormative dynamic, those are in the academy. So I don't want to act like there's a picket fence around the academy because that reproduces a kind of elitism. And I think we are witnessing a kind of populist uprising that is in part fueled by anti-intellectualism because universities have been elitist and have separated ourselves and acted like we're better than. So I want to challenge community. And I guess instead of the word engagement, I would want to think about What happens if we call it solidarity work? What if we imagined that the university was staff to community issues? What if we imagined that community groups came to us because they wanted help figuring out if the water was poisoned or the soil had too much lead, or children were learning, had access to a culturally responsive education, or if queer students felt welcome in their schools, or if immigrant students had access to healthcare and education the same way, that whether or not they had documents. What if we imagined ourselves as staff to community needs? What if our grants went through community organizations and we got the stipends? What if the IRB and the ethics were determined by community with the academy? I don't mean to set up a binary or an oppositional relationship, but there's something about university community engagement that presumes we have the resources and the knowledge that then helps the community, when the reality is a lot of times universities are gentrifying, undermining, extracting. So for me, critical community engagement might be critical solidarities between the university and other parts of community life and other movements in communities. And that's a project worth pursuing. I haven't looked at the university engagement, community engagement literature in a while, but having done a lot of work with a range of students who go into a range of neighborhoods or institutions that are deeply familiar or deeply unfamiliar. You know, doing volunteer work in a prison runs differently through the bodies of students who have an incarcerated relative and those who don't. Setting up food banks works differently for folks who have stood on those food lines, even if they're college students now, and those who haven't. And I think we have to attend not to the triggering, of course, which we have to, not to the pain, of course, but to the wisdom that people who bring those experiences to the university might be able to teach us. So our students who are themselves formerly incarcerated, those students who have been insecurely housed, those students who have psychiatric histories, they engage these experiences differently with a sensitivity, but with a knowledge that should be culled rather than privatized. And so I'm not asking us to like come out about it, but I think the invitation should be to recognize that our students who are undocumented know a lot about our systems. Our students who have been in foster care, who have been incarcerated, who have incarcerated parents, our students who have been taken away by Child Protective Services. When they do community service, they're bringing something else, and it's a gift. And the rest of us who can walk in and be shocked and cry should pause to learn. And again, that shouldn't require a coming out, but it should require that universities figure out a way to honor that knowledge that students are bringing with them, that yearning that students are bringing with them, and not act like we're all walking into this in the same ways. I've had students who say, oh my God, you know, we visit a prison and, you know, it's bringing flashbacks of my dad, but I know you have to be nice to the guards. You have to, you know, don't wear a braid. Like there's wisdom in our bodies. And if we could both protect folks' privacy and vulnerabilities, but also honor the wisdom our universities would be stronger, rather than asking our students to leave that at the door as though it weren't always haunting them.